Hi, my name is Brigid O'Quillan. I'm an educator. I work with the youth. I am a student, a communist, and I'm also just a regular working class person. So I'm not an academic or anything fancy like that. And I'm also one of the hosts of the Probably Cancelled podcast, which is a new revolutionary feminist podcast dedicated to uplifting proletarian voices as well as combating liberal feminism wherever we find it. In today's episode of Faith and Capital, we will be talking about something super spicy. We're going to talk about the sex trade and pornography. We're going to talk about how the right views those things, how religious people tend to view those things, as well as how the liberal left view the sex trade and pornography. And then we're going to come at it from a materialist and communist standpoint.
Yeah. And Brigid, I just want to say, super appreciative to have you on Faith and Capital, to be talking with you tonight. I've really appreciated your work. Esperanza was a major influence on both my theory and my practice,
Awesome.
in my relation to the porn and sex industry. So I'm just super appreciative of all the work you and fellow comrades are doing. And I just also want to reiterate, the Probably Cancelled podcast. It's really great. It's really fun. I really appreciate it. And I want to encourage everyone to go check it out because it's some great anti-colonial communist feminism. It really is grounding feminism through a proletarian and anti-colonial lens, which unfortunately is kind of rare. But I think the work y'all are doing is really spreading it and pushing it. So really appreciate it. And I'm glad to be talking with you.
Great. Thank you for the support. And also thank you for having me on.
Oh, yeah. Hell yeah. All right, sweet. Before we get started, I just want to tell everyone, if this conversation and this topic is really interesting to you or it really kind of speaks to your heart, I definitely want to suggest you go to the show notes. I'm going to post a list of reading materials that was shared with us by Decolonize Feminism on Instagram. So at Decolonize Feminism, they got some really great page. Go follow them, but also check out the list of reads that they shared with us. I think it's all great stuff. And the last thing I wanted to say is, as Brigid had mentioned just a minute ago, we're going to talk about 3 different political lines and put them in conversation with one another. And I personally have found that really, really helpful and clarifying for me. Brigid, I'm not for sure if you have had conversations with people where there's been a lot of muddiness around, well, what's conservative, right? What's reactionary? What's liberal or rad lib? And then also what's this materialist, revolutionary, anti-colonial line? Because there's similarities and differences among the 3. There's also contradictions and plurality within each 3. And so totally. I think a lot of folks can dive into this stuff and then they're like, wait, is this feeling or this idea I have, is it reactionary or is it more materialist or is it liberal? So hopefully putting all 3 of these, even though there's plurality and contradiction within each 3, putting these 3 in conversation and kind of step by step, hopefully it will bring some clarification for other people as well.
Absolutely.
Sweet. All right, let's go ahead and dive in. We'll start with the right-wing reactionary. Then we're going to do the liberal and the rad lib, which will clarify what we mean by rad lib later on. I've also had experience with the sex and porn industry, so I'm going to reflect on some of my former habits, practices, and rationalizations and ideas, my conceptions of it. And then we're going to talk, we'll wrap it all up with the revolutionary communist or the anti-colonial materialist line of the sex and porn industry. So let's get to it. All right, the right-wing and reactionary line. First of all, Brigid, I know, you've shared that you didn't grow up really religious at all. You didn't grow up in really conservative spaces, but did you have in your kind of studies or in your investigation, did you find anything particularly interesting about the ways in which right-wingers and reactionaries think about and talk about the sex and porn industry?
Yes. I think we all know that they come from a very moralistic standpoint, right? And these morals are decided upon their religious doctrine. So a lot of that is very, very much tied into the patriarchy and the ownership of women owned by one man. a lot of concepts of sin and temptation and, resisting the devil's temptations. A lot of it is very esoteric and very, it is from an idealist standpoint, right? Because they're basing their beliefs not off of necessarily material reality so much as just a moral standpoint. Yeah, I just find it generally kind of disappointing because when you talk about the communist line about the sex trade and the pornography industry, people automatically assume you are being a reactionary right-winger or that you automatically are coming from a religious perspective, which is definitely not the case. So I'm really, really excited to be able to flesh it all out here today and explain the differences with you.
That's cool. Yeah, sweet. I did grow up in very religious and also very reactionary communities growing up. So first of all, correct sexual and gender performance, I think, are very, very fundamental for the conservative standpoint, fundamental concerns to God. Or maybe the conservative is less religious. And I do think that they would say that correct sexual and gender performance might be fundamental to human nature. Or something in that manner. And it's hard to overemphasize how important, again, correct sexual and gendered performance is for conservative, particularly Christian spaces. That's what I grew up in. And I think everyone is kind of familiar with that, right? If you grew up in the United States, you're familiar with the conservative Christian emphasis and obsession with sexuality, right? They're gripped by sexuality, this interest in it, this conversation around it, and yet there's also this like terrifying fear of it. Everyone's terrified of sexuality. So yeah, I think that's at the basis of this all. But to start us off, so I think from a conservative perspective, the sex industry is bad and even exploitative. That exploitation is used often in conversation around the sex and porn trade because sex outside of a monogamous heterosexual marriage is just that. Not because it's like exploited wage labor, which was interesting when I started diving into Marxism, right? There's a pretty big difference in defining exploitation, right? One is it's exploitative because it's not part of this monogamous heterosexual marriage, and then another says, well, no, people are literally exploited because they have the fruits of their labor stolen from them. So yeah, exploitation for the conservative has nothing to do with production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus, but it has everything to do with transgressing the boundaries of conservative sexual ethics. And one of the arguments that I think is often made in reactionary communities against buying sex is that the buyer sees and relates to the person in the sex industry purely as an object rather than purely as a subject, as a means to an end, as opposed to an end in and of themselves. And I always find this argument very interesting as well, because I think in seminary I encountered this argument with like Martin Luther King when he was talking about Jim and Jane Crow and chattel slavery. It's a popular, I think, like 19th and 20th century argument that you talk about objectifying people rather than seeing them purely as a subject. But I think that, I guess I only hear that among conservatives and reactionaries now. And I think that's because philosophically we've come to understand that there is no, even like our best friends or your loved ones or, a neighbor, we don't purely objectify or purely subjectify people. It's like simultaneously both. Did you have any thoughts on that argument, that from the conservative side, that the buyer is evil because they're objectifying someone rather than purely subjectifying someone?
Yeah, so I do think from what I understand about the right-wing perspective is that they tend to demonize both the buyer and the seller from a more moralistic standpoint. I think a lot of that comes from the belief in the concept of free will, right? So they believe that everyone has free will, and if you're doing acts that are ungodly, that was your choice, and that's upon you to confess later on in order to get into heaven. But what I especially see more so than the demonization of the buyer tends to be the demonization of the seller, particularly usually women. It's usually women when they're talking about that. Even in the Bible, for example, you have Mary Magdalene, who was a disciple of Jesus and was one of the closer disciples to him in his life. Within the Bible and like within my life growing up, I always was told that she was a prostitute and that Jesus was associating with prostitutes and that made him a holy man, but she needed to be saved through him, right? Come to find out, as an adult, the Bible doesn't say that anywhere, that she was a prostitute at all whatsoever. Yet you have the church here seeing that there was a female disciple who was close to Jesus, and because of their patriarchal institutions, they could not have a woman be to that level of status within the culture overall. So they had to say something about her that would automatically, in their eyes, demote her status or discredit her. And from that, we get, the whole dichotomy of the virgin and the whore, which is like two opposite sides of the patriarchal coin, right? In determining how much you are valued as a female in the eyes of the church. The concept of, waiting until marriage to have sex. And there's a lot going into this, but overall, personally, I tend to see a lot of the demonization put upon the woman or put upon the seller in this context. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I definitely think that the primary sin is always projected upon the woman or the seller. And just to clarify for listeners, by seller, we don't mean like the boss or the pimp or John. We mean the person who's performing the work. So yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the rationalization behind that is that, first of all, there's a starting with an assumption that bodies and sex and nature, even nature itself, are evil, or at least like sex is meant to be like a private affair, right, within that monogamous heterosexual marriage. And so the sex and porn industries, and particularly the women and the workers, cause people, right, good men, good moral men, to violate the monogamous heterosexual marriage, which is, the result of divinely and naturally prescribed gender roles. So I think from the conservative lens that, there's this anger and that you're causing desire and you're causing actions outside of the boundaries prescribed. I also think that women not only are said to cause men to sin, but women are supposed to perform that particular role, and that's women are perceived to be wives. They're supposed to grow up and become a wife. And a wife it's gendered, it's racialized, it's sexualized, right? But a wife is to belong to and meet and fulfill the desires, including the sexual desires of a husband. And so when women are not performing that role, then one of the main problems with the sex and porn industry from the conservative line is that women are not actually being good wives. So yeah, as we've mentioned, to sell your body as a person in the sex and porn industry is to cause men to sin. To be the buyer of porn or sex is to fall prey to temptations, right? That draw men from what are perceived to be right sexual relations that can only occur within that marriage. And I also think that, to rape a woman outside of marriage is to undermine the husband's rightful claim and possession of the married woman's body, what should be his property from a conservative lens. And so I think there's an interesting conversation, an important conversation to be had around why obviously right-wingers aren't against all rape, but they're against kind of rape in theory or against some rape. And I do think that part of the problem is not that it's actually emotionally and physically harmful to the woman, but actually that it violates the role of the man, the power of the man, the property of what should belong to a man. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so all of this really does go back to the creation of the concept of private property and the creation of class society itself. If you look back, this is like a little bit of history lesson, but Friedrich Engels talked about this. If you look back in history, about 10,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution. This change in the mode of production necessitated that women, well, females, were commodified for their reproductive capacity because you need more laborers tilling the soil, raising the domesticated animals. Staying in one place instead of being nomadic changed everything. So with the change of the mode of production, changed the relations of males and females, to where the reification and commodification of women became more or less institutionalized. And this really denotes, like I said, the creation of the concept of private property for the first time, as well as the initiation of the development of class society and slavery, of marriage and prostitution. All of this happens within the similar time period, about 10 to 9,000 years ago. So this is interesting to note as well. The way religious people view this today is that women are private property of their one male owner. And if you violate that property, you're sinning against God, not against the woman, but against what God denotes to be correct if you want to get into heaven, right? Then you have the sins, and lust being one of those, right? So yeah, it's all tied up. It's all related, but it goes way back. You know, like this stuff goes way back. But the interesting thing is it's not permanent. It's not a permanent fixture of society. It's just how we have found ourselves in this particular mode of production, and the way it has been intensifying under capitalism and under imperialism as well. And it intensified under feudalism, and it's just getting crazier.
Yeah, I think you made two really helpful and great points there. The one thing you briefly mentioned was that connection between desire and lust, right? What they called lust, desire and lust, or with action. And so both, whether it's just desiring or actually some kind of physical act with a person, both are equally sinful. So like desiring someone is the same as actually sleeping with someone. And so I do think that is an interesting dynamic of the conservative political line and understanding of the stuff. But also, yeah, I hear you naming that at the base of this all is the emergence and the transformation historically of the production and distribution of things that are called goods. And that has included human beings, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so today I think there is like this myth that we can now have sexual relations or just relations in general completely disconnected, and this is a huge point I think of the conservative line, that sexuality is a private affair. It has nothing to do with like capitalism or the economy. It has nothing to do with any kind of social or political foundation to society. But I do think that it's pretty fair to argue that the way people are treated, particularly women, are as private property. And so a wife's sexuality and body is supposed to belong to, right, and to be possessed by a husband.
Yeah.
And yeah,
she has to save herself for marriage specifically, you know, and make a promise as a young teenager that you're going to make sure you uphold that promise that you made as a child to belong to one man and one man only, right? And the modest dress and everything, it's all very connected. But it's interesting to note as well. Sorry, can you hear the siren in the background?
Yeah, that's cool.
New York is so loud. It's interesting to note that these developments throughout history were all happening unconsciously. Human beings were making these decisions based off of their material conditions. I don't think that people were intentionally deciding to sweep the earth with patriarchy. It's just literally what was necessitated under agriculture, which is really unfortunate. And still to this day, we still have people walking like now we know the history. Now we know the history of how it was developed, and we could possibly have a pathway out of it. But we have people walking around as if this is just how the world has always been, how it was destined by God, on this earthly hellscape of flesh. And, when you get to heaven, then everything will be fine. You won't have to worry about anything. So yeah, it goes way back.
Yeah, it would be fun. I remember growing up thinking about heaven and this special place which I hoped to get one day. And I don't remember ever thinking about sex or sexuality in heaven. I think I probably assumed that everyone was asexual.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever talked with like conservative friends, but we would all just have our hands. It would be a Hillsong concert. I don't know if you know Hillsong, but it would be like a conservative music festival where we all have our hands up and nobody's having sex, and it's great. Anyway, yeah. Anyways, but before we name some of the proposed like solutions to these proposed, these problems from the conservative lens, I do want to reiterate that I do think that conservatives and reactionaries, they have a really big push to like shame men who buy from the sex trade or have habits with pornography. But I think, Brigid, you've really named the most important part of that, is that the main problem is women. And perhaps there could be a theological argument made throughout tons of churches throughout the U.S. right now, and of course the world, where the initial sin of the women in the sex industry caused the otherwise noble and innocent men to stumble. And so it violates our souls, it violates our purity, it violates some kind of perceived innocence, and that the primary problem is the initial sin, which is the woman.
Yeah, right? Well, even back to the Garden of Eden, right? Like the initial sin in the Garden of Eden in the Bible is that Eve, the woman who was born of Adam's rib, if I recall correctly, she was the one who caused humanity to fall from grace. And so, we have this archetype basically plastered over half of the human population now. So like you said, like the original sin, it's all very connected to just the demonization of females as the temptress, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So cool. So let's talk about briefly, and then we'll move on to the liberal and the rad lib line. What are some of the solutions that you hear? Are you familiar with some of the solutions that reactionaries propose to these problems, right? These problems of failed morality, or these problems of masturbating men, or these problems of failed marriages.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about porn at all? I realized we didn't really do that like within talking about the sex trade, but we might want to mention like how porn is viewed, and like being against masturbation, and being some Christians being against sex that isn't specifically for reproductive purposes. Like,
totally.
Yeah, so the porn industry really is a mainstream capitalist industry, and what it is quite literally is filmed prostitution. So it's embedded within what we would call the sex trade, which is pretty much an umbrella term. The porn industry makes billions and billions and billions of dollars each year. And what is on these porn sites isn't just paid porn actors that are filmed in Hollywood. A lot of this material is filmed without people's consent. It's videos of prostituted women that are uploaded. It's child pornography a lot of the time. Like, what we view as pornography is also really far-reaching and broad. How the right views sex in general, I'm not exactly sure because I wasn't raised Christian, but from what I know, there's not much sexual education happening at all. But young men specifically will get their sexual education secretly through viewing pornography. That's what I'm assuming here. I think it's really relatable for a lot of people, regardless of your religious or non-religious affiliation. And this overall is typically frowned upon by the church and frowned upon by the right for various reasons. I know that there are some groups of Christians who are against masturbation overall. They think that masturbation is tied up with lust and giving in to temptation again. There is also certain sects of Christianity who don't even believe in having sex at all unless it is for reproductive purposes, and they will lump in masturbation into this. So you can elaborate on that if you'd like. If you have any other insights of how the right views porn, feel free.
Yeah, well, I think as you mentioned, so we were talking about the whole original sin or the initial sin of the woman. The porn industry is where it's really heavily emphasized. So there is this general anti-prostitute kind of sentiment among the right, but when it comes to like the porn industry, I think that's where a lot of the conversation is being had, where women are not dressing appropriately or they're trying to make money off of causing, again, good, noble, innocent men, otherwise innocent men, to stumble, to violate the sexuality that is being prescribed to them, that should only be realized within a marriage. And as you also named, some right-wingers go as far. I didn't grow up in this kind of reactionary line, but among some of the reactionaries, yeah, it's said that sex is solely for reproduction. And it's interesting that you named that, because when I was in college and I started to think about sex, I remember walking with some friends, and I guess I had some conversations, or I was reading something, I'm not for sure, but I was like, wait. So if sex isn't just for making babies, then and I was like, and I know like a lot of people have sex just because they like each other. I'm like, well then what's the purpose of sex? Right? Is there a purpose of sex? Maybe there is no purpose of sex. And so I remember those were like the early days of my wrestling with my embedded assumptions as a child, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think generally when it comes to the porn industry, it's all about the buyer sins because they're desiring. Because with the porn industry, you're not actually directly with anyone, but you're desiring, and that's lust, and you're not lusting after your wife. Therefore, you failed.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you're a piece of shit. And then on the other hand, yeah, mostly women in the porn industry, they're the cause of all of these, mostly men. Again, two options for reactionaries. You're either a man or a woman. Women are causing all these men to fail. They're ruining marriages. And so you got to go after prostitutes. You have to go after people in the porn industry. And so, yeah, let's actually talk about that. What are some of the solutions from a conservative line?
Yeah, so from a conservative line, from all that I hear them speak about, they demand abstinence, right? So abstain from buying sex, abstain from viewing pornography, abstain. That tends to be the number one recommendation I hear from them. Otherwise, it is the criminalization of the work, both the buyers and the sellers. So yeah, both the John and the prostituted woman, as well as pimps, obviously. So they really promote legislation that criminalizes prostituted people, which ends up being extremely harmful to them, obviously, especially considering most of them are coerced into the industry in general, or are doing so under the thumb of a pimp. And yet they're still criminalized because, there's no mercy put upon them whatsoever, because it is looked at as they are, making their free will choice to do what they're doing, right? There's no other factors involved, like economics or anything like that. Well, sometimes it is, I guess, considered by certain Christian, like church charity groups. They will try to help women exit, but those groups are really far and few between. Overall, what we see in the American legislation in general is just full-on criminalization with no nuance. So it's a huge issue, obviously.
I think that point you made about the charities is really interesting, right? Because yeah, if you talk to evangelicals, the sex and porn industry, or the trafficking, is very, very popular. It's one of the main issues that I think a lot of people are organized around in evangelical circles. So if you go to like a massive conference, people do every year, tens of thousands of people will fill a stadium, and they'll talk about abortion and they'll talk about trafficking.
Oh, interesting.
And yeah, and as you mentioned, there are charities that will try and help mostly women exit. They'll say, they're trying to get people out of the industry, right, out of that work, but it's obviously not to combat patriarchy or capitalism or colonialism or imperialism. There's no acknowledge of any of that. The problem is that these women are not free. They're not freely choosing to be there, nor are they able to freely choose to be in a heterosexual monogamous marriage. I think that's like, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's also an angle that seems to be happening where they would also like to convert people to Christianity, and that's a main driving force, is like a missionary type situation. Yep. It seems to be more politically motivated by that than actually helping people, just in general.
Absolutely, yeah. To save someone from the sex industry, the goal is definitely to save their soul. And I think a lot of conservatives will explicitly say that one is way more important than the other. And it's obviously the saving of the soul. To save someone's soul is far more important than to help someone get out of an abusive marriage. To save someone's soul is far more important than Black people actually winning a better life for themselves here in the United States. Yeah. So I do think that's a great point as well. And then just to reiterate, there's a huge push for promoting and legislating political and economic policy that reproduces cis heteropatriarchy. Yeah, and also deterring crime or deterring sin. There's a huge kind of criminalization tendency within the right, of course, and that is not excluded here in this conversation as well. If you can try and scare people from having to sell themselves in the sex and porn industry, if you can punish people so hard and so violently, maybe they won't join the industry. I'm not sure, but that's pretty disgusting. It's never worked, and they're still doing it. And I think clearly they actually don't have any interest in ending the sex and porn industry, obviously.
No. But no, if they did, they would address the root, right, which is poverty itself, and
themselves.
Yeah, they are not at all addressing the root of the issue here, which is economic, right? Absolutely. So they're just slapping a Band-Aid over everything and like hoping it doesn't bleed through, and nothing happens.
That's true. Yeah. Well, cool. All right, that was a lot on conservative line. Let's go ahead and move on to the liberal line, which Brigid, you are more familiar with, and I'd love for you to go ahead and start us off.
Yeah, I'm kind of sad that I'm more familiar with the rad libs and liberal line. So the liberal line of conservative pornography, it basically is overall a extreme reaction to everything we just described, but so much so that it's just a huge slap left in reaction to the church, essentially. It is predicated upon free will as well, but also like ultimate individual freedom. Like that's the freedom that they're after, right? Like liberalism is very much about the individual, and the individual is sacred to them, and individual choice and individual freedom are central to that. So radical liberals, which is a term that we're going to be using during this podcast, is a specific subsect of liberals, but it has like these people have a more radical flavor, and they present themselves as being radical, but they are still operating from a liberal framework sometimes it's even just straight up libertarian framework. But under a veneer of being like revolutionary or communist, they are not fully aware of their place within this like idealist world. So the term radlib is a very online term and probably originates from Twitter discourse. Radlib is short for radical liberal, like I said, which is someone who appears to espouse radical rhetoric or optics, but is still marred in liberal ideology. Central to their ideology is individualism, Western chauvinism, identity reductionism. So, like not focusing on class issues usually at all. Lifestyleism is a huge problem, and anti-communism are rampant due to a life of being submerged in imperialist propaganda. These people are usually living within the West. I'm just going to preface that as well. And most Western leftists today are what you would call radical liberals. It's very much like when the right talks about quote unquote special snowflakes, these are the people that they're usually talking about. But to state it simply, I know that was a lot, rad libs are leftists who are just not materialists. They're still idealists and typically also utopian socialists, even if they claim they aren't. So they view the sex industry as being connected to women's empowerment and women's liberation, as well as sexual liberation and freedom from the historical oppressions of the church and other major religions.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's plurality and there's difference within this liberal and this rad lib line that I think is interesting, because it's one way that the rad lib political line will say, no, we're not liberal and we're not conservative. But they actually use Marxist analysis to rationalize and to justify. Personally, I remember when I had internalized this rad lib political line, and I would say, among many others, that because capital has dominated the world, it's like capital's dominance justified. It absolved me of personal responsibility or the need for any kind of pursuit of solidarity, which our final political line kind of shook me out of. But that was definitely a sentiment that I had internalized, and I think it's pretty popular. I'm sure you've heard it or seen it online, right?
Well, I used to be one. Like I was an anarchist for 15 years, and if you meet an anarchist, like 99% chance that they are operating under this, like, freedom of the individual is important over everything else. So like this is me for a long time. I feel like I understand it really deeply because I used to actually think this way, more or less.
Definitely. Yeah, so you named a lot of good stuff about the emphasis on individual choice and how they conceive of power, empowerment. But let's flesh out some of these really main and prominent ideas. First of all, counter to the reactionary and conservative side, bodies, sex, and nature are perceived to be objectively good, right? We are naturally desirous beings and we are naturally sexual beings. And exchange relations under capitalism, right, between buyers and sellers of any and all commodities are also natural. I think this is how the argument might go. And it's based on the equality of the buyer and the seller. And so all of these things are objectively good. So purchasing and selling sex is a good. If an individual desires to make money by selling sexual services, they should be free to fulfill their desires. If an individual desires sex, they should be free to purchase sex so that they can freely fulfill their desires. Did you have any thoughts on that? The ways in which bodies, sex, and nature, but also exchange relations, kind of all those things combined are said to be perfectly good. So why would any combination of the two, right? If you're exchanging bodies, if you're selling sex, if you're commodifying nature, like why would any of that be wrong if body, sex, nature, and exchange relations are based on equality?
Right. Yeah, I find this very interesting because a lot of it, I think, stems from what was called the sexual revolution of the 1960s. when women were really vying for equality in a way that they never really had before. And I view our society today on the left to be kind of like a direct delineation from that, in combination with, it is a reaction against the church. And so much so that it's almost as if our thinking caps aren't really on all the way. Like, we'll accept pretty much anything if it's for the sake of saying, like, fuck you to the religious right and what people view as patriarchy. But what is particularly interesting about this ideology is that we criticize capitalism, right? It's a normal thing to criticize and critique all industry except for the sex industry. It seems like this particular industry, the sex trade and pornography, is just above critique. And that's what I really want to point out here is, why is this? Why is this happening? Because that's not a materialist or Marxist viewpoint of the world or of anything. And if we're going to critique an industry, this is a really good one to critique because of the amount of sexual violence that occurs within it. Like, I think most leftists would call ourselves feminists, and be against rape culture, but then when it arises within the sex trade or pornography, and then proliferates into our daily life and interactions with other people, and even into our dating life, like, a lot of us refuse to critique the industry in any way. And I find that to be, like, truly, honestly insidious in its ramifications. And also the fact that if you do critique the industry in any way, rad libs and a lot of liberals will assume that you are reactionary and call you one, just for having like an actual Marxist analysis of an industry like we do with any other industry. I think part of that is because they think you are critiquing the people who have OnlyFans, or you're critiquing like the individuals, right? Here it goes back to individualism. I think they think we're critiquing individuals rather than the capitalist industry and the capitalists who like promote this industry and keep it running and make all of the money off of it. So there's a distinct misunderstanding, like right from the get-go, thinking that we are critiquing individuals participating in the trade or coerced into selling sex, when it's really not that. But that might be the defining feature of liberal ideology on this subject, is that you aren't really allowed to critique the sex industry. It's just not allowed. Like, you could even lose friends or lose a friend group over it if you do so publicly. So
yeah. Absolutely. It is really interesting that the rad lib line, a lot of folks who are a little more familiar or have studied a little bit of Marxism, in my early studying of Marxism, right, I expanded from this liberal to this rad lib line, where again I ended up using the dominance of capital to justify and absolve my newly created behaviors and my habits and my practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, well, the sex and the porn industry, those are capitalist industries, just like any industry. But I would absolve any of the very real and important material differences between the contradictions within this industry and the actual conditions of the masses of people who are structurally coerced into the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So another main point that I think you are emphasizing is that how ultimate power lies in the freedom of individual choice. Power is not really conceived any other way. Power is all about that freedom of the individual to make decisions, and that's kind of like the highest. That's like the highest state of human being, man. If we can all just individually choose everything, and liberals, not just in this regarding the sex and porn industry, but there's a self-conception, right? That our life, our success, maybe not our failures, although sometimes there's a deep kind of self-hatred if people have like economically or socially or communally kind of deteriorated. There's a self-hate, but especially economically, or, if you're a really comfortable settler here in the US, people think that they've individually willed their life to whatever kind of comfortable situation it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of the sex and porn industry, the individual is fully human when they can make decisions for themselves without restraint. And this is a really important argument, I think, from the liberal line, right? The right to purchase sex should be allowed, and especially with their private money, their private property. They should be able to use their money to buy sex whenever they want. And of course, the kind of anti-communist critique against anti-colonial and revolutionary communist line is that we're actually impeding the freedom of the individual to sell their body in the sex industry.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and another point, if you could kind of flesh this out a little bit more for us, I think is really important, is the freedom of choice and freedom of possession as empowerment. So, right, it's not just like people should be free to buy and sell, but actually to sell is one of the most empowering decisions a woman could ever make, right? From this rad lib line. So could you say a little bit more about this emphasis on the empowerment of kind of choosing certain kinks for yourself, or selling sex in the trade, or becoming a worker in the porn industry? Yeah, could you say a little bit more about that perception?
Sure. Yeah, I could say so much on this subject. First of all, that's a huge subject. I could talk a long time about that. But I
Empowerment alone.
think, yeah, I really think that their definition of empowerment is very different from mine, or how mine is today, how I understand the word empowerment today. I do not consider barely surviving to be empowerment. I don't consider being coerced due to poverty to have sex with strangers to be empowering. I don't find material possessions to be empowering. Maybe that's just me. To me, actual sexual empowerment or personal empowerment as a woman includes not ever being coerced into having sex with people I don't want to have sex with. It includes not being commodified myself. Like, as a Marxist, I really do believe that sex and relationships should never be commodified. And it seems as if under the rad lib ideology, that goes completely out of the window. And when you're talking about the sex trade, all of a sudden everyone becomes a capitalist. All of a sudden everyone's a girl boss capitalist. So I think it comes down to that. People's definition of empowerment is different from mine. And I think also overall, people in the West, leftists in the West, are coming from a really, really Western viewpoint, where the people who are on the soapbox, people who operate within the sex trade and get the microphone, usually are funded by huge corporations like Pornhub or OnlyFans. And they're typically upper echelon, what you would call sex workers, typically white, typically coming from a middle or upper class background, typically very safe in their environment. They're not working on the street. And typically the people who with the microphone and with the computers to, put out their opinions are generally doing okay in comparison to the vast majority of people who operate within the sex trade globally, right? So the idea that we have of the industry here in the West is very much the propagandized version of it, and the very sanitized version of it, that these industries that are making money from it want the public to hear. Because if you can frame it in a positive light where everyone is empowered, It's saving people during a pandemic. Look at this. Like these women are really owning their bodies and owning that, they are actually the ones in control over the men. If you can frame it like that, you make way more money that way. You
Yeah.
really have to twist the story in order to do that, because the vast majority of people operating in the sex trade globally, and even in the United States, they're not doing it because it's their passion. They're not doing it because it's their hobby. They're doing it because they need to do it in order to barely survive. And if it were truly empowering, I would ask them, why is it that we don't see men doing it? Why is it that we don't see wealthy people doing it? Because we can all see that there is definite class divides within the sex trade in general. There's definite class divides. And you can see that even in the different terms for, like, we call it escorting, and then we call prostitution something else. It's literally the same thing. The only difference is the class difference. The only difference is, like, how much money the escort is making. But in our minds, it's this like sanitized version of prostitution, which is not the case at all whatsoever. I have a lot to say on this subject, but I just find it very curious that it seems like the liberals are attempting to repackage patriarchy and sell it back to us. But it's really like a capitalist project, right? Like this and a very successful one so far. But yeah, I could go on, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, I think you brought up a lot of great points, and even the language that you have emphasized around owning your body and possessing your body, right? Your body is basically your property. These are the conceptions. Why is it a good thing? Because this property belongs to this individual, and they can do whatever they want to it, especially if that means kind of advancing, accumulating more wealth. So why, how could that, from a kind of liberal capitalist perspective, how could selling your body, doing anything with your body, be conceived wrong when it is your property?
Yeah.
Right. And another thing is that particularly the liberal line, less so the Radlib line, but the liberal line, dominant within this kind of general political line, it mystifies the power, mystifies power within the exchange relations.
Yeah.
Between the buyer and the seller. As you said, women or sellers are perceived to dominate men. So perhaps there's this recognition of historically men have dominated women, right? Patriarchy has persisted. And yet here's this rare opportunity. How do you fuck patriarchy? You join the porn and sex industry. And because that's how you are in control when, because the guy wants sex, when really we know that the seller needs the money commodity more than the buyer needs the sex commodity. And that's where there's an inequality of power, and it does not lean towards the seller.
Yeah. Yeah, the liberal conceptualization of that is extremely static, and like extremely underdeveloped in understanding power and market dynamics overall in general. But if you are someone who is surviving by selling sex, you need that money way more. Like you said, you need that money way more than the person who has it and can spend it, right? Who has like excess income that they can spend on something that they don't need. You literally don't need sex in order to survive. It's not even a necessary industry at all whatsoever, for human survival or for like society to flourish or continue functioning. But when you have somebody who is surviving off of this industry, you will automatically be coerced into providing services that you would not otherwise, through the pressures of the buyer, right? And pressures of the market. So you might go into, for example, the porn industry. You might move to LA and decide, okay, my like acting career isn't working out. I guess I can just go into porn and try that. and, make enough money to not have to work too much. I can still go to my casting calls. I can still be able to pay my expensive rent in Los Angeles. And you go and you sign your contracts and you sign up for what you are willing to do on camera, the sex acts that you're willing to do. You sign the paperwork and you go to set and you start filming, and all of a sudden these things start happening on set that you did not consent to in the paperwork. And if you object to that, what happens is that your job is held over your head by the producers, and they say, okay, well, I know you said you weren't willing to do this, but you could do this for us, right? Because if you don't do this, the next girl's going to do it, or the next person's going to do it. And if you don't do this, you don't stand a chance in this industry at all. So you kind of got to do it if you want to be in porn, right? So through this process of breaking down your barriers, and this is just one example in one sector of the industry, the levels of coercion, first of all, you're financially coerced into it from the get-go, like from a basis. And then to have your boundaries and your barriers like chipped away by the market itself, because everyone is in competition and the market is so flooded to the point that it is today, in the streets, online, everywhere. You're going to be coerced to do things you don't want to do. You're going to be coerced into doing things for way lower prices than ideally you would be willing to be able to do. But when survival is on the line, people will make decisions that they would not otherwise. So then that begs the question, what is the nature of choice? Like, what is the nature of free will? Because the way I understand it is that there's an economic basis behind all of this. And the liberal line tends to prefer to ignore all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the market, right? Our desires are perceived to be just natural, I mean, innate within us. Like we're born with a set of desires, and they just kind of statically stay the same all of our life, I guess. But the market, in particular, for this liberal line or the porn industry itself, expresses natural desires, our natural desires as sexual beings, and so repression of these desires or of the right to buy and sell is evil and unjust. And so I think there is this. There's also this popular argument that if there's a demand, it's a natural demand, and if there are people in the industry, working in the industry, then there's a natural desire to sell, to work in the industry. And it's this unwillingness to actually consider what is producing the industry, why the industry exists, as well as how the industry is not just an expression of innate sexual desires of naturally sexual beings, but the industry, both porn and sex trade, it shapes our desires, and we kind of shape the industry as well. There's a dialectical relationship between the two, right? We're not just born wanting to be choked during sex, but on the other hand, the sex industry is going to, it's shaping our desires. I think there's that really interesting and important relationship between how desires are formed, but they're both like constructed and shaped, I guess.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about how these industries have shaped a lot of our sexuality in general. Like you said, the desire to be choked, like how many people would naturally think of that if they had never heard of it or seen it in porn. It's not something that we are naturally doing, but it is a very common theme that we are exposed to over the course of our lives and pretty much propagandized into, even as young kids, like teenagers. And there are some really deep ramifications to that with how this market, which is in competition with itself, shapes our sexualities and our views of one another as well, like how it shapes how men view women and how women view themselves. And I think a lot of people aren't even aware of how much of their sexuality has been commodified. For a lot of us, it's our entire sexuality has been completely commodified and is a product of capitalism, which is really interesting to think about. But the fact remains is that within, like, I'm going to go back to pornography, for example. Within pornography, you have various production companies that are vying for the capital. They want as much money as possible for as little work as possible. How do you do that? The way that they seem to have formulated that over the decades that this industry has been around is to compete by making more and more extreme content. Because the more extreme your content is, the more noticeable and shocking it is. Like, shock value, first of all, sells. But then in turn, people's sexualities morph alongside this market getting more and more extreme. The more porn you watch, the more desensitized you get to the basic, like what it would be called vanilla stuff. And all of a sudden, you start seeking out more and more shocking material to be able to get off. So the market is shaping our sexualities, and we are responding to reinforce and encourage the market to keep producing more and more shocking and degrading content. And that's how we end up today with like a lot of the population emulating sexual practices that would be like the equivalent of the Marquis de Sade, who of his time was like the sexual deviant of sexual deviants. Nobody did what he was doing. And when people found out what he was doing, torturing people during sex, he got literally like locked up. People wanted to kill him. People tried, like the whole village tried to kill him. But today, this type of sadism in sex is like mainstream. And it wasn't even like that 20 years ago. But today it is. Today, kids and teenagers are being told that if you don't want to have boring sex, you need to have sadistic and masochistic sex. And so it's really interesting to view it alongside the development of the capitalist market, of the sex trade, and of the porn industry, and trace it back and see just really how far we've come. And also the fact that it's really difficult to make critiques of this at all whatsoever, because people will be mad at you. Because if you're critiquing it, a lot of people, they feel like it's a personal attack, because that is, at this point, like that's how they get off. That's how they view their sexuality. That's how they view sex with other people. And people take it really personally. But I think it's a really valid critique to make. I could extrapolate on this for days. But it is very interesting how sex and relationships have become commodified to the extent that they have, and the liberal left refuses to critique this. Very, like, this is so at the core of our being and core of our intimate relationships, and I just think it's really worth looking at.
I was in a course on mysticism in seminary once, and one of the projects from a fellow student of mine brought to the class was on something with mysticism and BDSM. And I don't remember the contents of the project, but I do remember, ever since I started thinking about this, I do remember that no one ever talked about it. No one ever questioned the violent, like, sexual practices and imagery surrounding this particular project in our liberal, like, class on mysticism. And
That's alarming.
Yeah, absolutely, it is very alarming. And yeah, I think it's something that seminaries, or folks, perhaps if you're listening and you're in seminary right now, I think it's a really important and interesting part of the conversation that's not happening. It needs to be happening. And let's talk about the sex and porn industry and kind of our embedded assumptions. And the last thing before we talk about the problems and solutions proposed by the liberal political line, I also think there's this interesting, the few times where, like, social, like, analysis is brought in, There's an emphasis on minority gender and sexual identities are being excluded or marginalized within the industry. And so the way you combat racism, the way you combat cis heteropatriarchy within the industry is to celebrate trans and gender nonconforming persons, or Black persons, or Indigenous people, people from the Latin American diaspora, right, within the industry. Celebrate them, support them, and kind of help them get more buyers or something like that. It's pretty sick once you have a more materialist line and a more actually like a structurally anti-colonial line, a communist line. But when you're kind of in that liberal or even that rad lib world, it sounds like the right thing to do. Here's a historically oppressed person, therefore let's help them really take off in the sex and porn industry, which usually they're not. Usually they're proletarian. They're poor.
Yeah.
And they'll never get anywhere with it, obviously. But
yeah, this is a huge subject as well. I feel like all of this could be its own episode, to be honest. Like it's really difficult to really encapsulate it in just a few minutes of this conversation. But this aspect of identity, reductionism, you see it all over the left. You see it with liberals calling for more female drone strike operators, in the military. You see it all over the place, and it's like, okay, is representation really at all part of our liberation? I don't think so. But when you look at it in the case of the sex trade, and that includes pornography, minorities, people of color, people of the third world are grossly overrepresented in people who are forced to participate in this industry. It is not glamorous. They are not making money. They're barely surviving. There's like I saw a statistic from 2012 that said that there was an estimated 42 million prostituted people in the world. And that's an old statistic. And I'm actually giving you the low estimate of the range that was given online. So you can only imagine how much that has expanded since 2012, and especially during a pandemic where people are losing their jobs, losing their source of income all over the planet. Imagine 2012 was 42 million prostituted people, the vast majority being people in the global south, and here in the imperial core, the vast majority being people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous women and children. That is who's making up the army of labor in the world for being sexually exploited in exchange for, some money to buy food, or maybe, if you're lucky, a roof over your head. So this entire push to have more of these people who are overly represented within the trade and within the industry overall to be represented more, for example, in pornography, is extremely insidious to me. On the left, we talk about how many trans women die each year, and people give a updated count like every couple months. And at the end of the year, it's a lot of people just within the United States alone, just in the US alone. When you look into these deaths, you find that a lot of them, more than you would imagine, are people who are found dead in hotel rooms and motel rooms because they were forced into prostitution. Because people who are trans, people who are queer, especially queer youth and trans youth, face so much familial discrimination and get kicked out of their house, face so much discrimination on the job, face discrimination in housing, that they end up homeless. I think it's about a third of trans people during their life will become homeless at some point. That's a lot of people. Like within that demographic, that is huge. And what happens is a lot of these people get pushed into the sex trade because of this. Which obviously endangers your life more than pretty much any other job. Um, so to fetishize people of color or trans people and utilize that fetishization to suggest that they should normalize participating in this industry and actually, like, liberals try to glamorize it. I find that really disturbing, like really, really disturbing. And I think one more thing I want to touch on before we change subject is this common proposition by the liberal left, by radlibs, to say that sex work, what they call sex work, and working in the sex trade and working in pornography is just like any other job. It's exploitative under capitalism, just like any other job is. And while I agree, as a Marxist, obviously every other job is exploitative, the level of sexual violence incurred within other sectors of which you could be working is not anywhere near what people endure within the sex trade, especially like stripping and prostitution, in-person sex work. You cannot compare this to any other job. The levels of trauma incurred upon people when you're forced into this trade, like, that to me is really worrisome, that people legitimately believe, that leftists and supposed Marxists, some of them legitimately believe that this work is like any other job. And again, I would beg to differ, and I would ask, if it's like any other job, why is it that people of color are so overrepresented, women are so overrepresented, and poor people are overrepresented? Like, it's not like any other job, and I think we should stop pretending like it is.
Yeah, I think those are excellent points, and I think you're naming one of from a liberal line, one of the problems of the whole situation, that sex work from this liberal line is not seen as legitimate or treated as equal to every other form of labor, and therefore is stigmatized and targeted. So any critique of the industries itself is actually contributing to the stigmatization and to the targeting. And before we name some solutions, just to continue with some of these problems, there's a denial of, the denial of the right to buy and sell porn or sex criminalizes human nature, bodies, and sex, according to the liberals. Another issue would be sex and gendered bias and social inequality deny women and trans and gender nonconforming persons from being able to freely make decisions for themselves as individuals in the industry. And the right-wing criminalization or even the communist critique of the industry criminalizes the majority of workers who are believed to freely choose to be empowered in and by the industry. This is, again, the liberal line. And then the last problem, I think, for liberals is that the individual and natural desires and sexualities of individuals are culturally and socially repressed. So we have like this mix of socially conservative products, the denial of that freedom of the individual and the market freedom, or a rad lib line might say, well, there's a lack of a legalized, regulated sex industry. These are all problems. These are all reasons why sex workers and buyers cannot freely and safely sell and consume sex. So what are some of the solutions that we hear from the liberal and rad lib line to these perceived problems?
Yeah, like you said, overall they seek to destigmatize the industry. Like I said, like they're trying to diversify the industry that is already like overrepresented of people of color and gender minorities. Like, it's very interesting there. They seek to promote and expand the industry and overall normalize it. Most liberals and radlibs would like to either fully decriminalize the buying and selling of sex, and if not decriminalize, a lot of them seek to fully legalize the buying and selling of sex, which is very different. That's like state sanctioning the buying and selling of sex at that point. So yeah, it's basically you're not allowed to critique you're only allowed to promote and expand.
Yeah, that's a great point. Expanding the rights of sellers and buyers to sell and buy sex, who again are perceived to be completely equal in power. If not, power is like it actually tends and leans towards the seller, the people in the industry.
That's what they believe.
Absolutely. There are political movements which seek to kind of these pro-sex worker reforms and labor laws, right? Well, there's arguments. Well, let's raise the wages or expand benefits to sex and porn workers. There's let's unionize people in the industry, and also
how do you even unionize an industry of people who are like purposely operating underground because they don't want to be above ground, they don't want to be public. And then how do you identify the bosses? Are you going to unionize against the pimps? Because that's not what's happening here. It's just, the whole concept is it's very interesting approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've also seen there and even a suggestion to start worker cooperatives of sex and porn industries where the workers themselves or the people in the industry themselves who are actually doing the selling, they make all the decisions and stuff, and hope I think the goal or the idea behind that is we got rid of the bosses, now they're really in power. There's combating certain kind of political and economic policy. There's combating cultural stuff, like pushing sex positivity, right? Sex and bodies are bad for right wingers, and so if you can push that sex and bodies are good, sex work. Another idea that I think that they're trying to push back is that sex work is physically and emotionally harmful to most people in the industry. I hear a lot of rad libs say, no, it's actually really great physically and emotionally for people in the industry.
Yeah. Well, they'll even go as far as to say that, for example, and this is, again, the identity aspect of it, is that disabled men are owed sex. And so we should have state-sanctioned people, or we should have the state pay for physically disabled men to be able to buy sex from prostitutes. This is something that people tend to promote, and I think they think they're coming from a really good place. I think they are. But it really is, at that point, incel territory to state that all men are owed sex. It's kind of, this whole idea that like men need sex in order to properly function in society is very like an incel talking point. So they will promote this like state-sanctioned prostitution of women for the sake of physically disabled men. But this conversation is never it's curious to note that it's never had in the opposite, where they would promote the same services for disabled women. You don't hear people talking about that. So the misogyny there kind of like lays itself out when you hear people talk about the industry and the way that it functions. They're saying that men need sex in order to have a good quality of life, but they don't say the same for women. Then they will say that, okay, if disabled women are having struggles in surviving because obviously the state is not helping disabled people enough, they encourage disabled women to enter the sex trade in order to survive, and they view that as like destigmatizing and diversifying the industry. So even just that alone, the way people view sex as like a divine right of men, and that male orgasm is more important than addressing any of the issues of the trade, it's a problem.
Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point about this general expectation that men should be able, first of all, men are given two options: to either buy or to steal, which is rape, around sex, right? And those are the only two options given for sexual relations in this world, and those are the only two possibilities. And I think that worldview, that conception of sexual relations, that imagination of relationships and sexuality in this world is so fucking sad, right? It's either
Yeah, they're also saying that they're implying that physically disabled men can't have fulfilling relationships, like actual relationships, or go on dates and have sex with people. Like even that in itself is really ableist, if you want to talk about ableism. The implication that these men can't, develop their personality or, have fulfilling relationships with women who aren't being commodified. Yeah, there's a lot wrapped up into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was a lot on the liberal and rad lib line. And so real quick, before we move to our final segment of this conversation, excuse me. I thought I would share a little bit, do a little bit of self-analysis of my own habits and practices, and then some of the rationalizations that I had internalized for my practices around porn when I was participating in the industry. And so, yeah, I'm going to start with my practices, and then I'll move to my conceptions and the rationalization that I had accrued. Because I grew up right-wing evangelical, and then I moved into a more liberal space for at least like 5, 6, maybe even 7 years. And so with that transition also came transitions around my understanding and relation to people in the sex and porn industry. So, and I share this not to highlight my individual stuff, but hopefully perhaps a listener, particularly male comrades or fellow, followers of Christ, will resonate, or maybe say, oh, you know what, I've thought that too, or I've had that similar experience. Maybe there will be some kind of common similarities here, and I'd like to invite folks to critically reflect on your habits and practices and your conceptions as well. So that's, again, I'm not trying to air out my own stuff, but hopefully this can be helpful for moving towards more accountable and more solidarity relations. All right, so first, practices. It seems to me that I started looking up models because I had come to a new understanding that sexual desires and attraction toward women were objectively good, and that it was okay to pursue my instant gratification by masturbating to images of women. Again, this is kind of counter to my conservative upbringing where sexual desires and attraction toward women was kind of objectively bad outside of the heterosexual monogamous marriage. And so even though I started this practice during a period of my life when I had great community, a thriving relationship with my partner, zero anxiety or depression from work because I was in seminary and loving it, my newly held liberal conceptions, beliefs, and ideology, I think, enabled me to transform some of my habits and practices. So while I wasn't doing it as often in the beginning, I do think the main change at the start was primarily ideology and not conditions or material experiences that I was having. Over the years, I had increasingly moved from a conservative understanding of sex and sexuality to a liberal one, and that, I think, ideologically allowed me to form new habits and practices. But years later, I would find myself living in a new city far away from my long-established community, hours away from my best friends, working a terribly, terribly depressing job, and COVID had initially kept me from being able to develop new friendships. So I'm working the grill in the evenings at a fast food joint, trying to navigate the beginning of a deadly pandemic. My wife and I have both lost our community and our people, and I become depressed as fuck. And so to cope with my anxiety, my loneliness, my alienation, and my depression, I would binge drink. I would masturbate to bikini or nude models, and then binge eat regularly throughout the week, but especially on nights I would get home from my shitty job. So those were the practices that I had formed And again, they were way less frequent earlier on, but at this moment of great alienation and depression, and when my conditions and my relations, my experiences had become pretty terrible, that's when I really latched on to my porn habit as a way of coping with my anxiety and coping with my stress rather than finding more healthier ways. So some of the rationalization I had, having been raised with a conservative and right-wing understanding of sex and sexuality, and transitioning to a more liberal one throughout college and seminary, I had come to believe that to deny myself, to resist my urges, was repressive. It was conservative, and it was reactionary. So to repress my sexual desires and attraction was to reproduce the very sex and gendered domination that I, as a progressive, had come to see as evil and unjust. And so to be against the porn and sex industry, or to deny myself a moment of pleasure, was to reproduce the world that said sex and sexual desire outside of monogamous heterosexual marriage was bad, right? It's either or. So to not do what I wanted sexually when I wanted was, in my mind, to reproduce the sexual norms and values of the communities in which I came from. I reasoned that sex and bodies are good, therefore we should enjoy them. And within the boundaries of my own monogamous heterosexual marriage, I thought masturbating to porn was my secret solution to the contradictions of my desires, since I knew my partner would not support my habits and my practices. But I can't stress enough how much I thought being anti-porn was pro-patriarchy, conservative, and oppressive, both to the masses of women and people in the sex industry and to humanity in general, honestly, because I saw it as sexually repressive and as opposed to being without restraint and free. And this is a common feeling I've heard among friends who I've long talked with about sexuality in the sex and porn industry, that people either sexually repress themselves and adhere to conservative expectations and demands in a monogamous marriage, or they consume sex and porn through the industry or through endless hookups without ever having expectations of people they sleep with and trying to develop like deeper relationships. So it's either repressive expectations or commitment, or freedom from any kind of expectation and commitment. And so, yeah, those were the practices and my rationalizations. Brigid, did you want to say anything about that kind of self-reflection?
Yeah, I think that's really relatable to a lot of people. I think a lot of us are, first of all, conditioned to view these practices and these consumptions as normal, natural, just like an essential aspect of life. I think especially for young boys, like adolescent, teenage boys, and young men, it is so naturalized to consume pornography that they cannot imagine a life without it. It's almost like a rite of passage, or just like something that men are supposed to do, because everyone around you is doing it. So why wouldn't you do that? I don't think the same can be said for adolescent girls, although that's changing pretty rapidly these days. But overall, the pressure is upon young boys to start engaging with this material at a young age. Like, I think the average age of exposure to pornography for young boys is 11 years old now, which is really young. And that's just the median average, right? So a lot of people are a lot younger when they are first exposed to and start consuming pornography. Some of them are a little bit older, but the average age is 11 years old. So I think a lot of people have had this habit as part of their life for so long and for so many years, it becomes a part of your everyday ritual, and you literally cannot imagine your life without it. Because most men who utilize porn are addicted, whether they want to admit it or not, or whether people want to admit that you can be addicted to porn or not. You definitely can. And people definitely struggle with stopping, right? Because so much of your emotions and your neurology is tied up within that stimuli, and with consuming that product. Like when you bind the act of orgasm, which is a beautiful, like, it is a spiritual event in essence. Like, it is a beautiful peak you reach, like, emotionally as a human being, you know, and you seek that kind of pleasure. Um, and when you bind that peak experience as a human with a commodified version of sex that gets more and more extreme as time goes on, or, you know, changes your view of women around you as time goes on, your neurology is literally bound up within that product. And also your emotional stability. Like you said, you were using it to cope. And I think under capitalism, especially for young boys and men, and people in general, but I'm going to focus on men right now because they're really driving this industry. I think that the amount of alienation that males feel in general and the lack of connection with other people that they're allowed to feel under living and being socialized under patriarchy. I think a lot of them use pornography as an outlet to just feel anything at all. And that itself can be a crutch, like an emotional crutch that people use like a substance. And yeah, I just think that your experience is a really, 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 really relatable experience for a lot of people, both men and women and everybody in between. And personally, I also used to consume pornography. I used to be a sex worker myself, creating pornography for survival. And it took me a long time to realize the implications, like the materialist implications of what I had been participating in. Although I feel like most of us, at some level, maybe if it's like subconscious or deep, we know that it's not good, that the industry is not good, and what we're consuming is not healthy for us. And I mean, we have the science to back, like we have plenty of science to back this. I think a lot of people intuitively know this, and I think a lot of us can relate to, for example, the act of masturbating to porn, and then you climax, and all of a sudden, after you climax, like you feel so disgusted with yourself, and you can't believe you just did that, and you're like, what the hell did I just do? And you close the computer screen. Like, I think that is our intuition or something subconsciously telling us, like, hey, what the fuck are you doing? Like, this is so shallow. It's such a shallow, like, commodified understanding of sexual relations. And I think a lot of us really struggle with that. And honestly, like, my sex life has gotten a lot better. My sex life and my masturbation life has gotten a lot better since I stopped utilizing porn. It's just like you have to make that commitment to yourself to try.
Yeah, and I do think there is really something about the emphasis on increasingly, especially under neoliberal capitalism. We are 50 years into neoliberalism, and the alienation experienced by not individuals but we as people is heightening. It's not
Yeah,
slowing down; it's heightening.
yeah.
And so I think as personally as a Maoist, or if you're listening and you're like, well, I'm a socialist or communist, or however you want to identify, the question is about solidarity, right? And so it's true that we are deeply alienated people. And to me, I think where revolutionary communism or this anti-colonial analysis of the sex and porn trade, what it brought to me was this necessity of choosing solidarity. It's true. I'm a very alienated person.
Hmm.
We are very isolated and kind of broken down at work. Our communal relations are just being destroyed,
Hmm.
where we're literally just kind of holding on to fewer and fewer friendships. We're deeply dependent upon a personal other, right? A partner or something like that. And so as our communal relations break down, I think more and more people will go to greater lengths of coping with our alienation, our that at the roots, as we've talked about, is produced by capitalism and colonialism. And but for me, as someone who's trying to have proletarian solidarity, as someone who wants to support revolutionary struggles and, even one day wage revolutionary struggle here in the imperial power of the world, it's so fundamental that we combat not only our consumptions, but our for some people, decades long habits of failing to live in solidarity with the masses of proletarian and women disproportionately, but people of all gendered expressions across the world. So yeah, let's go ahead, if you want to, Brigid. Let's wrap this up. Let's dive into the revolutionary communist and anti-colonial analysis, and how maybe there's differences and similarities from the right wing and the liberal and rad lib line.
Yeah, it is very, very distinct. So the communist position on the sex trade traditionally has been abolition. Almost every great communist leader has been staunchly opposed to the sex trade, and that includes Marx himself, Friedrich Engels, Lenin, Alexandra Kollontai, Mao, Sankara, and even anarchists such as Emma Goldman and Lucy Parsons wrote in opposition of prostitution or put in legislation in their government against prostitution, as well as economic uplifting of people to reduce poverty so that people would not be coerced into that trade due to economic coercion, right? Yeah. Coming out of capitalist society. They saw it as an oppressive force based upon human exploitation, and they were correct about that. They also understood that socialism means providing resources for all people, and through socialism, we can broadly eliminate the poverty and misogyny that perpetuates the global sex trade, right? Because the sex trade literally operates on the crux of capitalism and patriarchy. It is like the centerpiece of how those two institutions intersect, and it is undeniable. And we as Marxists make a point to address this, because if we don't, our project is rendered useless. Like we're fucked if we don't identify this as a major issue for emancipation of women and emancipation of all people. Thomas Sankara, the elected president of Burkina Faso, who was one of my personal heroes, was extremely explicit in his writing and speeches that women's emancipation was dependent upon their freedom from sexual exploitation, and that this feature of society represented the crux of women's subjugation in itself. So I have a quote from Sankara that I wanted to read that's like really poignant. He says in one of his speeches, "Prostitution is nothing but the microcosm of a society where exploitation is the general rule. It is a symbol of the contempt men have for women, and yet this woman is none other than the painful figure of the mother, sister, or wife of other men, thus of every one of us. In the final analysis, it is the unconscious contempt we have for ourselves. There can only be prostitutes as long as there are pimps and those who seek prostitutes." So there's just overall a really long tradition of communists addressing how big of a problem this issue is, and then putting into place policies, economic policies, that work to disrupt this institution, which would obviously take decades and maybe even centuries to alleviate. But the key feature is identifying it as an issue in the first place, which, a lot of leftists just outright refuse to do.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a really great point. As the two socialist revolutions that we've had, the USSR and the Chinese Revolution, following their revolution, following the economic policies that were advanced following the revolutions. Yeah, I'm sorry. Hold on.
You're good.
Yeah, you make a great point with the socialist revolutions, in particular the revolution of the USSR and the Chinese Revolution, where after the revolutions, the economic policies that were put in place were addressing poverty and addressing inequality, and we start to see a decrease in the amount of prostitution or the porn and sex industry. And that's not because of repression, because a lot of places have massive repression. And guess what? It just goes underground, right? It still
Hmm.
persists, if not
Hmm.
expands.
Yeah.
But in these places, there was actually an undermining of an interest. Perhaps even like a collective acceptance of or of buying sex and commodifying our our sisters, our mothers, our comrades, but also there was less of a need
Hmm.
to sell. So I think those are really interesting.
Yeah, it was dual pronged. It was economically and ideologically when you look at both the Soviet Union and revolutionary China. Like take China for example, before their revolution in 1949, women were, like everywhere else, portrayed as commodities, and they were printed in ads for products like highly sexualized in order to sell more products because sex sells. People knew this a long time ago that sex sells. And after revolution, and well, even leading up and during revolution, but after the revolution succeeded, um, you have economic policies put in place to uplift women in every area of life. So you have the economic basis attempting to be fixed. Like, it's a slow process, but at least they started to try. But then on top of that, ideologically, people were encouraged to view women as equals. And now, instead of women being portrayed in ads to sell products, women were portrayed in propaganda as equals, as, military personnel who were revolutionaries, just like everybody else, who were, it was, our duty to enter the workforce to ensure the success of the revolution and ensure the success of our people. The ideological aspect put into theory, right, that people all over the country were reading as to like what is the emancipation of women and what does that look like and how should we change how we view uh, relationships and how we view women overall to decommodify them. In revolutionary China, that was a distinct difference pre and post revolution. So yeah, it's really our job to uplift this idea of women's emancipation and women actually as equals, but not on a surface level or capitulating to capitalist ideals, but really, put the economic security in place so that people don't have to enter the sex trade in the first place. And also, push for the correct ideology, which is what we're attempting to do right now. But I find that really important.
That's really good. And let's continue to look at the differences and similarities of this ideology compared to the liberal and conservative ideology, right? So bodies and sex are good things, of course, but that doesn't mean they're objectively good regardless of context, right? So, for example, there are some sexual relations and conceptions that are actually violent, exploitative, and emotionally and physically harmful or spiritually degrading, so on and so forth. Whereas the conservative line says bodies, sex, these are all bad things outside of
Mhm.
this marriage. And the liberal
Mhm.
line says, no, they're just objectively good, right? Any kind of sexual relation, any kind of um, uh, sexual desire that you have, those are just objectively good.
Mhm.
I think we would perhaps affirm that, of course, bodies and sex are good, but you
Mhm.
have to look at the actual relations. How does it actually affect the people?
Mhm.
Um, Another point is that the industry is not equivalent to its class of workers and producers, right? When we're talking about Walmart, um, there's a class structure within Walmart. There's the I think 5 or 6 Walton family members at the top, and then there's the masses of people in Walmart, and they are not the same. They're not equals, right?
Yeah.
And or we could talk about the I'm trying to think of some other kind of industry, the lumber industry or the oil industry, right? The people industries are not just made up of a bunch of equals. They're divided by a class.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about the porn and sex industry, there are pimps and johns, and then there are people at the very, very top of the industries. And then there's the mass of people who are producing all this profit by selling their bodies for just mere terrible, shitty poverty wages.
I think that's a huge issue because the Western left, at least overall, refuses to address this from a class-based analysis. It's just a refusal that most people aren't willing to touch. They refuse because then that would be, addressing that there are major issues. And when I say major, that's an understatement. Addressing that there's major issues means that you could possibly create more stigma. And, avoiding stigma is more important than people's actual lives or physical safety. But there's also this element of just at its core misunderstanding what coercion is, what that word means, and what coercive sex is. I am in the camp, I believe that coercive sex is called rape, and that when you have financially coercive sex, it falls under the category of rape. Like, there really is no way around it. And, I think when you really lay it all out to people, they have no choice to agree. I think even children understand the exploitive nature of this industry. It's just that the liberal ideology and the pursuit of individual freedom alongside the fuel of the market and the capitalists who are the ones propagandizing the most, it really obscures the reality of material reality itself.
Yeah, and with a more materialist analysis of this, right, we can see that there are concrete and important differences between working in the sex industry and other industries, as you had mentioned earlier, right? The liberal line rejects that all work is work, whether you're working at Burger King or whether you are a upper management, right? You're not a boss, but you're upper management for Google, or whether you're working in the sex and porn industry. Like, for I think liberals or even sometimes rad libs, there's just this assumption that there are no difference because they're all capitalist industries. But that's a very idealist and abstract. It's an immaterial analysis. There are important differences, and we have to honestly name them.
Yeah.
I think I remember Esperanza at one point in a conversation talking about how the risk of being burned by like oil,
hot oil,
hot oil, say like at McDonald's, is different from the constant risk of being raped. And I think when I heard her say that was just really clarifying for me that the importance of analyzing first, but then acknowledging the very real material differences of conditions of workers or people in different kinds of industries.
And this is really coming from the Western left as well. When you look at the left in the global South, people do not overall have this very pro-sex trade ideology because they are living in countries that have much higher rates of poverty than we do in the imperial core. So you see this way of life and the ramifications of this industry way more in your face your entire life growing up. So people in the left in the global South overall do not have the same analysis that Western leftists tend to have, and I think that's really just a symptom of growing up within the imperial core and being exposed to so much capitalist propaganda our entire life, while also being sheltered from viewing the darkest parts of this industry that are literally in every borough of New York City where I'm living right now, every county of every state. it's so pervasive, but it's more under wraps here in the United States, I think. And I think just the economic differences between the West and the global South are some of the reasonings for that. But
yeah, and that, as you've alluded to, right, at the base of this, there's also colonialism and imperialism. The global sex and porn industry could not survive without particularly U.S. imperialism doing what it's done for the last nearly 100 plus years now. So in sites of where there's neocolonialism or where the U.S. is directly waging an imperialist war, and not just the U.S., but other imperial powers as well, colonialism and imperialism, both kind of expressions of capitalism, that this is where the porn and sex industry thrives. This is where the production of the mass army of labor is produced. And so there's, you can't be anti-racist, you can't be feminist, you can't be whatever without understanding that capitalism, colonialism, and imperialism are producing the worst conditions and relations for these people who are structurally coerced into selling their body, not to empower themselves, but to physically survive or to help their loved ones survive.
Yeah, you really cannot be an anti-imperialist or anti-colonization without also being a sex trade abolitionist. The two just are, you cannot call yourself an anti-imperialist and still support the expansion of the sex trade for many reasons. This is another thing that is such a huge topic. I wish we could do a whole episode on it. But there seems to be this belief that the sex trade and prostitution has existed in every corner of the earth for all eternity, which is not true at all whatsoever. It's wildly historically inaccurate. And what we see is for a lot of indigenous societies all over the world, the sex trade was only brought to those societies through the process of colonization, where you have basically an incoming army ransacking the land, pillaging and raping the land, and as well as pillaging and raping and sexually violating and commodifying the women of that land. And it is a war tactic. It is a time true war tactic that is still utilized to this day. To this day is a weapon. But for a lot of the world, the concept of the sex trade is a colonial import. And I think that is something that a lot of leftists do not realize because of how much propaganda we're under to believe it's like the world's oldest profession and it's just like the natural order of humanity. We see that in the United States with the extremely high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And that's something that leftists talk about a lot. But what most of them do not talk about is where this is coming from. And a lot of it, probably the majority of missing and murdered Indigenous women cases, are directly tied to their involvement in the sex trade. And this is directly correlated with the extremely high levels of poverty, that being the highest levels of poverty actually in the United States, in the United States being in reservations, right? It is also just known by colonizers to be a really easy place to go to do crimes and get away with it. And there are settlers, colonizers who know this, and sex buying men who know this, who specifically will go to the reservations to buy sex or to kill. And I just really think that this is such an issue, not only in the US, but all around the world, where incoming armies like US militaries are setting up brothels in Vietnam and Korea. Like, we cannot just turn a blind eye to this and not address how it is directly impacting so many people within the global South and so many people here, indigenous people. Um, and there's a lot of room for critique, and it really needs to start happening.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that has been really eye-opening for me when I've in my journey for learning this new political line and transforming my habits and my practices is that the sex and porn industry is inseparable from colonialism and imperialism and capitalism.
And patriarchy, like it's everything we hate.
Yeah.
Sex slavery, like it's literally the amalgamation of everything wrong in the world. Classism, sexism, misogyny, like trans misogyny. It's literally like the amalgamation of everything that we as leftists say we oppose. And yet you have a huge section of Western leftists upholding it as empowering and freeing and sexual liberation, when it really couldn't be farther from the truth. And the thing is, when you start dissecting it like we have here, it's undeniable. And a lot of people shake their head at themselves and they're like, how can I have thought anything differently? It's right all in our face. It's really just blatant. It's blatant. And the power of capitalist propaganda is so strong that a lot of people are literally living in an illusion and operating a lot of their life and operating their sex lives based off of this. And so I'm glad that we can have this conversation today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've really appreciated you coming and spending these last almost 2 hours talking with me about these 3 different political lines. The work you all are doing at Probably Canceled podcast is, again, just completely so fundamental to the building of a proletarian movement here in the U.S. and also just the spreading of proletarian solidarity with the masses of people in the sex and porn industry across the world. So, Brigid, thank you so much. You're amazing. Really appreciate your everything that you've brought and shared with us. And I hope we can. There's always more things to be talking about concerning the pornography and the sex trade. So I'm sure we'll be able to do this again sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right on.
It's been great.
All right, 1 second. So, cool. Hey, sorry that went so long.